Hi, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series for IFA. I'm Sarah Davies. I'm the General Counsel of IFA, and we are so thrilled to be able to bring you this very timely program. It's been a volatile year as it relates to tariffs, and continues to be so. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have Greenberg Traurig present the current tariffs landscape and its impact on franchise systems. Greenberg Traurig is a frequent counsel and advisor to IFA on not only franchise matters, but also privacy and supply chain and other regulatory matters, in addition to representing the IFA Law Center and litigation matters and filing amicus briefs. And so really grateful for their time and for this presentation. And so just a few housekeeping items. We do record the session. So if you are watching this after the live presentation and you have questions, feel free to email me and I will get them to our speakers. If you do have questions during the program, if you'll just enter them into the chat and we will address them at the end of the program. The program is for informational purposes only, and so it doesn't constitute legal advice. Additionally, the opinions of the speakers are theirs and not the law firm that they work for. And if you, again, it'll be accessible on demand for IFA members. And then we also will email a link and a copy of the deck to everyone that registered for the webinar after we close. So with that, Alan, I will turn it over to you. And thank you again. Appreciate the time.
Thank you for having us, Sarah. We appreciate you and IFA. Today we have a pretty robust agenda for this 30-minute webinar. So for everyone out there, my name is Alan Greenfield. I'm one of the chairs of Greenberg's franchise practice, and we'll have a couple of my great colleagues, Toni Brown joining us, as well as Laura Rabinowitz joining us as well, who specialize in supply chain and in tariffs trade matters. So today's agenda, first want to talk about some recent changes in tariffs policy. And as Sarah mentioned, right, it's changing pretty frequently as recent as this weekend. We're then going to touch on the impact of tariffs on the franchise systems, as well as some strategies and mitigation tools that franchisors can implement to navigate this current environment. And then we're going to talk about the impact of tariffs on international franchising and suppliers. And then lastly, we're going to touch on how these tariffs are impacting FDD disclosures. And so if I start, we're going to do today's session as a bit of a conversational Q&A for informational purposes. So I'm going to start off with a question to Laura here. And Laura, if you can tell our audience here, what's the latest in these ever-changing tariffs landscape? I know there was an August 1 deadline. How confident are we that that is a hard deadline, and is that the latest?
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everyone. Happy to be with you. Let's start. Let's go, if you could go 2 slides ahead, and then we're going to go back, if that's okay. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so first of all, I want everyone to note that this chart is just accurate as of July 9th, which is when we did it. There have been changes since then. So, where are we today and where are we vis-a-vis August 1st? So the Trump administration, I should say the second Trump administration, has put in place sectoral tariffs, and now they're rolling out country-specific tariffs. And these are on top of the tariffs that they put in place in the first Trump administration, which were just on products of China. So starting in July of 2018, about 2/3 of the products coming from China carry an additional 25% or 7.5% duty. And that's on top of the general duty, which is product specific. So our general duty many products come in free of duty, but it goes into over 40% duty. So it's very product specific. And then we have for products of China, it's the statute that the administration used is Section 301. So we have Section 301 tariffs on 2/3 of the products, and that's 25% or 7.5%, which was put in place starting, as I said, in July of 2018, kept in place by the Biden administration 100%. So those tariffs are still in place. And now that there's a second Trump administration, the tariffs on products of China are still in place. So everything on the tariffs that I'm talking about today are in addition to the tariffs on the products of China. So the sectoral tariffs, which they're rolling out one by one, and they're having an investigation, and then there are sectoral. So currently there are additional 50% on steel and aluminum products, and that's no matter the country of origin of the steel and aluminum. And the steel and aluminum tariffs are very broad reaching because it's not just steel and aluminum, but there are lists of derivative products. And that's where franchisors can get caught up in these additional tariffs. It includes window and door frames, stainless steel sinks, countertops, of course, screws and bolts and all that, piping, tubes. So stoves, it really impacts franchisors who are constructing a facility. And then automobiles, we can see here, and auto parts, copper, which is going into effect August 1st. Pharmaceuticals, there's a bit of a rollout period there, but we're expecting additional sectoral tariffs, including the ones listed here. Lumber, which could in fact impact the industry, for example, trucks and parts. Those are going to be rolled out in the near future as well. And then we have the country-specific tariffs. And this is really a huge shift in the way that importers into the US have to pay duties, because it always was globally, we only had general tariffs, as I said, between 0 to over 40%, and it was product specific. So it didn't matter if you were importing from the EU or Bangladesh, but now it does. So now it very much matters what is the country of origin of the product. So first of all, as I said, this chart was as of July 9th. As I'm sure many of you know, the EU and the US negotiated an agreement for 15% tariffs. So almost all products coming from the EU that's being manufactured in the EU and being entered into the US will carry an additional 15% duty. So it's sort of been talked about that this was a victory of sorts for the EU because the Trump administration had said they were going to impose 30%. So to only have an additional 15% is kind of a win. But if you think about that they were at 0 before April of 25, then it's not such a win. Japan is at 15%, so that's also more recent since July 9th. Indonesia, we had that at 32%. They now have an agreement at 19%. The Philippines is at 19%. South Korea is at 25%. So, and so here you can see the other countries. As the agreements are rolled out by the administration, we're filling in the chart. But you can see they're all pretty high, 25%, 35%, 40% for Myanmar. Vietnam at 20% is I think pretty onerous for companies that, particularly for companies that moved out of China after July of 18, moved into Vietnam to now have an additional 20%. It is pretty onerous. The UK seems to be the only winner, I think, at 10%. And then if you could, Sarah, if you could move back one slide. And then the big three unknowns yet, which China, they're negotiating right now. the deadline for the China tariffs, from the administration is August 12th. We don't know where we'll be, whether we'll see an agreement by August 12th or not. I think the fact that they're negotiating now means we probably will see something. But right now, as you can see, tariffs on products of China are, we still have the Section 301, and that's the 7.5 or the 25% that I have listed there. And then we also have an additional 30%. So that the 30% has been in place since, well, the 20s, all of it since April 2nd of this year. And then Canada and Mexico currently are at 35% from Canada, 35% from Canada, 30% from Mexico. We're going to see where we land. Maybe not by August 1. I'd like to think we'll hear on Canada and Mexico by August 1. And I also would like to see that the administration will keep the exemption for USMCA compliant goods. So those are goods that comply with our free trade agreement with US, Canada, Mexico, where they were still coming in duty free. And that's a big percentage of goods coming from Canada and Mexico. For example, franchisors who are buying fruits and vegetables from Mexico, that would be a big change if those are no longer free. And those currently qualify under USMCA. And of course, we get a lot of our energy from Canada, which currently is at 10%. Certain energy related products are 10%. If it's USMCA compliant goods, it was also still free of duty. So that's a big open question. So Alan, your question is, where are we going to be August 1? I think the administration has been, as I said, filling in that chart. Will they fill in 100% by August 1? Maybe, maybe not. But I think for the big country, I think they're focused in on the big countries, although we haven't heard very much about Canada and Mexico negotiations of late. So we'll see. And I would just caution one last comment before I let Toni comment is just because they've set an agreement, let's say the EU and the US at 15%, the way the administration is rolling this out does not prevent the administration from at some point down the line say, we're not happy with this agreement, we're going to raise it. Or we're very happy, we're going to lower it. Like, I don't think that any of this is set for the next 3.5 years.
I appreciate that, Laura. And actually, Toni, for you, a question for you is, what strategies can franchisors operating in the U.S. take to mitigate or avoid the impact of these tariffs that Laura was telling us about?
Thanks, Alan, and thank you everybody for joining today. So it's hard to hit a moving target, right? And, as Laura was describing, things are still very much in flux with the tariffs, but there are certain things that you can take from a contractual standpoint, and Laura can also speak to it from kind of the importing standpoint to help mitigate potential risks. And so from a contractual standpoint, what's important to note is that the legal responsibility for paying tariffs falls on the importer of record. But even if, you as a franchisor or the entity in the agreement, whether it be kind of a purchasing co-op for your system, if you're not technically, quote unquote, the importer of record, there still is a possibility that some or all of the costs of these tariffs could be pushed through to you. And really where that is going to lie is what's in your contract. And so it's very important to, know what the terms of your agreements are, take a closer look at your supply agreements to understand where the responsibilities are going to lie. Now, does that mean that you need to take all of your existing agreements and try to renegotiate everything and open it up? No, that's not what we're saying. But, going forward, you just want to be more cognizant of it. So some specific mitigation tactics from a contractual standpoint are making sure that you have kind of clear language around price change mechanisms. So if the supplier is the importer of record, 9 times out of 10, they're going to try to pass through some of those additional costs to the buyer. So they're, most suppliers are not going to absorb all of those costs because their margins are tight as well. And so making sure that your contract specifies when prices can change, putting a floor or a trigger on the amount of the price impact to the supplier before they can pass through some of those costs to the buyer will help to protect you a bit in those situations. Also, making sure that your contracts kind of clearly define what is the landed cost, what components make up the landed cost. Are the importation costs and tariffs included in the landed costs, particularly in situations where you have negotiated fixed pricing and you've negotiated your landed costs? You want to make sure that you know what all is made up of that. And so that you're trying to stop situations where the supplier can unilaterally push through a price change because of impacts on its cost. Other things are trying to make sure that you have audit rights. So if a supplier comes to you and says, hey, I've been hit by all of these tariffs, and so my costs have increased, so I have to pass through some of this to you, and your costs are going to be increased. Having the ability to audit that to a certain extent, to be able to verify the increase in the cost and making sure that additional costs are not being passed through to pad the margins of the supplier, and that they only are passing through direct costs that either you pre-negotiated or you're limiting it to the actual impacts of the potential tariffs. And then, to the extent that you have the leverage, you can try to negotiate a most favored nations clause within your contract to make sure that, to the extent that the supplier is trying to pass through cost to you, you're not the only customer that they're passing through all those costs to. So if they're giving better margins or conditions to some of their other customers that purchase kind of similar volumes of that same product, that you're getting the benefit of that most favored nations.
Thank you for that, Laura. Anything you want to add on how franchise companies operating in the U.S. should be, steps they can take to help mitigate some of these tariffs risks?
Sure. So, I mean, Tony's absolutely right. It's the importer of record is responsible for the duties. And so my mantra these days, because 100% of the companies I work with are the importer, and my mantra is they need visibility into their supply chain. And duties are made up of what is the classification of the goods, what's the valuation of the goods, and now what's the country of origin of the goods. So those three really should be looked at. For example, valuation, if the invoice price says it's $100 a unit, is there any way we can chip away at that 100 to make it something less in a legal way? So for example, international freight is always deductible. Foreign inland freight and foreign port charges, which are the trucking charges from the foreign factory to the foreign port, those are also deductible if there's a through bill of lading to the US. So if it's set up correctly, that can be a line item deduction. If there's a buying agent involved, buying agent fees are always deductible as well. If there are royalty payments or warranties involved, if structured correctly, those are also can be deductions. So I'm just thinking about, as I work with companies that are importing and we're looking at their invoice, we're saying, what's part of the dutiable value? You have to pay duty on the value of the components, the foreign labor, and the factory's profit. But you don't have to pay duty on markup if it's structured a certain way. And there's a way to do that so you shave off certain markup. So those are, we're looking a lot at chipping away at the value in a legal way. And then
Appreciate
also,
that, Laura. Oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. I was just going to say, and then also looking at classification of goods, because classification, it would be the general duty, and certain products, as I said, carry very high duty. So you want to look at what is the correct classification of the goods, and can I move that product, whether it's a raw material, a component, or a finished product, can I move it to another category which is compliant, but potentially at a lower duty rate? So we're just trying to be very aggressive and try to chip away at those duties because they're exponential now.
Appreciate that. And Toni, this question's for you. We were just talking about franchise companies operating in the US. How about franchise companies operating, around the world? What should they be thinking about with tariffs and also in connection with their supply chain management?
Absolutely. And so, for our clients that operate globally, what we tell them is that we need to think about tariffs strategically, right? So, this current administration has been touting tariffs. Tariffs are not going to go away anytime soon, even though things are still in flux. The tariffs are going to be here. So you need to think about it strategically and really look at the impact to your particular system. All tariffs are not created equally. And as Laura was describing, it's very product specific, but also country specific. And so the first thing that we recommend doing is conducting a global tariff risk assessment with respect to your particular system and your supply chain. Where are your products coming from? What are the types of products? What is your exposure to these tariffs? Because it's not something where every franchise system will be impacted, nor will every franchise system be impacted in the same way. And so you really need to look at your supply chain and your products and equipment and understanding where they're coming from and where the risk is and what your exposure is. And then, depending on your exposure, it will impact what level of flexibility, if any, you need to build into your contracts to protect yourselves or take the steps that Laura was just speaking on to try to minimize the impact of the tariffs and the price fluctuations. And then also be transparent, from a franchisor's perspective, to the extent that you conduct this assessment and there are going to be risk and there are going to be the potential for price changes or supply chain fluctuations because you might need to, diversify your suppliers and source from different places. If there's a potential that the tariffs are going to have such a material change, you want to communicate that. You want to have a certain level of transparency with your franchisees and your system because you don't want this to kind of blow back and be a surprise to the franchisees, right? If there's going to be material price changes or you need to make material shifts in your supply chain strategies, you want to communicate that and you want to do it in a way that, promotes, collaboration with your system, buy-in from the franchisees. You don't want to create a situation where, you're faced with these price changes and now also you're having to manage the relationship with your franchisees or your ultimate end customers. And so, being proactive and transparent and having open lines of communication with the franchisees with respect to kind of the potential impacts of the tariffs, as well as what you're doing as a franchisor to help mitigate that, can help ensure that you are maintaining a positive relationship with your franchisees and the system.
Appreciate that, Toni. One of the things we've seen with franchise companies who operate around the world is for convenience for helping their franchisees open faster abroad, the franchisor was maintaining a stock of supply within the US and prepaying for the equipment that may be coming from Asia or from Europe. We've seen franchisors reevaluate that because if it's coming from Asia now going, there may be less of a tariff coming from Asia going directly to Europe, without stopping through the US, where before franchisors were doing it to help facilitate the speed of opening. Now it may not make sense to do so. And so, we've seen franchisors evaluate their current practices in terms of, where are your international franchisees procuring mainly equipment and certain supply. We've seen that. Another point, and Toni was touching upon this, it's, being, when we say transparent with respect to franchisees, with the tariffs we're dealing with, franchisors also have legal obligations, especially with the US franchising, but also certain countries around the world where there are disclosure obligations, right? And we have FDDs that provide for your estimated initial investment, a franchisee's estimated initial investment in building out a franchise. And so, franchisors need to look at their FDD and their initial investment, as these tariffs change, to make sure their overall range is in line with new tariffs that may be imposed on key and expensive equipment and build out costs. Now, something tells me it's going to be a lot like COVID, where things are going to continue to be in fluctuation. And we had examiners push back during COVID and would not allow us to include disclaimers with respect to challenges franchisees may face with respect to COVID. They were requiring franchisors to take those out in item 1. Here we haven't seen, necessarily tariffs as a general practice, including disclosure on tariffs in item 1. But for non-exempt franchise systems where these FDDs will be reviewed by examiners, I would anticipate examiners, commenting on, a tariff disclosure as a potential disclaimer. Now, it's going to depend on how that disclosure is drafted, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if it's an item 7 right after your initial investment. I can see an examiner raising that as an issue. I guess, we have another minute or two here. Laura, what else should we be thinking about on international operating internationally, not just into the US with respect to tariffs? Anything franchise companies should be, keeping in mind here?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So, yeah, that's a sourcing strategy. I mean, that's exactly how companies should be thinking now, is doing the math on that transaction. If you want to get that product to the EU, is it better to import directly from the country of manufacture into the EU, or to import, which I've also seen, import components from Asia, let's say, to the UK or the EU and manufacture the finished product there. So those are the strategies that companies should be thinking about now. I actually worked with a company recently that was importing Chinese components into the US and manufacturing the finished product in the US. And they had a very small facility in the UK, and they've done the math, as I said, and they're closing the US facility, the US production, which I don't think is what this administration had in mind, and they're expanding their UK production. And so the product becomes country of origin UK. And then they're going to keep some of the merchandise in Europe, and they're going to import country of origin UK merchandise and import it into the US. So
very helpful, thank you. And I see we got one question regarding, the impacts of on franchising. Are they applicable to small businesses in general? And I think we touched on that. The answer is yes. We expect companies to pass along these increased costs. So, it's not just the franchisors' costs increasing. I expect, and we all expect, that franchisees and other small businesses will also, feel, increased cost, the stress that comes along with increased costs and operating costs and build out and just in day-to-day purchases.
And
So
I would say not just small businesses, but large businesses too.
yes. Yeah. I don't know if we have time for additional questions, Sarah. We defer to you, given, the time limit of the webinar.
I mean, if anyone else has an additional question, please do drop it in the chat. We can go for a few more minutes. And then also, if you want to pose questions later, again, feel free to email me. my email address is just sdavies@franchise.org.
So one last thing that I would add is that this is also playing out in the courts as well. And so we're still gonna have to wait and see the legality of the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to enact some of these recent tariffs. And so that was declared unconstitutional in May, but it's still, those tariffs are still pending or still in effect pending appeal, which is scheduled to start, I believe, this Thursday on the 31st. And so we'll see how these more recent tariffs play out in the courts. And so that also just adds to the excitement and the ever-changing chart.
The ever-changing chart. I mean, I would say for sure the litigation will go to the Supreme Court, I would say. I would doubt if the Supreme Court did not take the case. So whichever party will appeal to the Supreme Court. But I also think that if it is at the end of the day struck down as unconstitutional as it was done at the trial court level, I'm fairly confident that the administration will find a workaround to impose these tariffs. They'll do it under another statute. They'll do increased, I mean, they were successful in their first administration. They had an investigation, which is how they're doing the sectoral tariffs. They'll have an investigation and then they'll roll out the tariffs that way, sectorally. So
Laura, does Greenberg have a resource where on its website where people can go to just check whatever the current status is? Is that a resource that's maintained on the website? The chart
on tariffs,
Yes.
not exactly like that, but we issue
Okay.
alerts.
Okay, perfect. Is there an email address where people can subscribe, or is it just on the
If
website?
people contact me, I don't know. Alan, I'm not sure if on the last slide is our contact information. I don't remember.
Let me look. If not, I can include it whenever we email the it is.
Yeah, there we.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay,
anyone who's
perfect.
interested in tariff information, you can just email me and I'll add you to our mailing list.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for the really wonderful presentation. I appreciate so much the practical guidance. That's always so useful to our members, is having tangible takeaways in addition to understanding what the current regulatory landscape is. So appreciate the time, and thank you all for those that joined. We'll send the presentation around to everyone that registered, and appreciate all of you joining. Thanks. Bye.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.